Hello and welcome to today's session on MYOB Advanced Business 2023.1 upgrade. My name's Nick Savage Mayday, and today I'm going to be covering off the agenda that I have in front of me. Now, to start off with, I'm going to talk about the system changes in terms of approvals and the new delegation and reassignment process. We're then going to have a look at the new actions within business events and notifications. We're then going to have a look at deletion of snapshots and tenants and how that has changed. We'll then look at finance and in particular the default sub-accounts and how those can be set up. And in terms of the GL codes, we now have the ability to change GL codes in the chart of accounts, and I'm just going to go through the methods of doing that. And then I'll just talk briefly on how we can now sync financial periods for inactive or new companies. We'll then have a look in terms of payables. There's a new tick box called quick batch generation for payments, and that means that we can actually streamline the process a little bit better. Now, in terms of CRM, we'll look at the extra validation checking that's been set up for duplication records. I'll also talk about what improvements have been made to tasks, and then we'll look at how we can actually convert customers when we're doing the sales order process through opportunities. We'll then look at distribution, and firstly the blanket purchase order improvements that have been made. We'll then also look at some of the new features for sales orders, so in particular negative lines and the automation behind that. And then the new order type, which is mixed order, and this is generally to do with types of businesses with counter sales. And then lastly, we'll talk about archiving features that we can do for shipments and sales orders. I'll then touch very briefly on field services and the fixes that have been made to calendars and maps. And then I'll go on to projects. So we're looking at the tracking of inventory by project and task. I'll just explain the new parts to that. I'll also mention about the transaction reversals on allocations and explain what happens there. And then I'll mention also to do with some of the new reports that have been added into the system for projects and what they look like, and also give you a bit of a show and tell on that side of things. And then lastly, we'll go through the manufacturing. So that's changes to the user interfaces within certain screens and side panels that have been added to those screens as well. And then I'll mention about the processing of materials within a production order. Handle that now. And then lastly, I'll just mention about the MRP history screen and some of the checking in terms of audit history and for how long it actually takes to actually run these. The first bit I'm going to go into is I'm going to go into the system side of things, and we're going to talk about the approval delegation changes. So this is quite a major change, and this is why I'm leading with it. And when it comes down to the approvals within the system, we now have the ability under the employee or the user profile to actually go through and set up, in this case, I've set up all of my approvals are going to now be handled by Candice between this period. So I can actually set up a delegate to handle all the approvals so they flow through to her between that time period or until I deactivate her. Now, the way in which this works is that when you are setting this up, you set up who's going to be your delegates. You also need to go into your approval maps, and in this case, based on this step and based on the rule actions, as long as you tick allow reassignment of approvals, then it will use this new method. Now, what that means is that if I come into here and say, for example, you can see in here, I'm the approver for this bill. Now, if I just change and update the date on it, and just set it back a day, for example, now it's all based around your business date. So if I've gone into there and just changed that, when I go back in and take it off hold or pop it on hold and then remove the hold, you can now see that Candice has actually been assigned the bill because she's now my delegate and I'm actually away on a break. Now, as you can imagine, that once you set this up, there is actually an en masse screen, so you could actually use this reassign delegated activities to go through and process everything. So you could just click on process all, or from a more streamlined point of view, you just add in an automation and it'll do this all for you. So it's quite useful to just be able to, assign approvals to your delegates. The other thing that's been added though is under approvals within time and expenses module, you now have the reassignment method. So you can see that these are my approvals currently in there, but say for example I want to go through and say I want to actually assign this to somebody else in particular. Now I can tick the box and then assign it, and then I can say, well, I'm actually going to set up Bill as the approver for this bill. So I can go into there, and if I go reassign, what it would do is it would look at who my delegates were and then assign it to the appropriate person based on the approval map if it's ticked. Or I can simply ignore the delegation, reassign it, and then that's now approved. And you can go back in, and when I go back to here and refresh it, you can see that it's actually being reassigned, and you can see that it's now with Bill, and that's the original person. And then you can even go through and check who originally had the document in particular. So it's quite useful for not only setting up who's going to handle all of those approvals for a certain period, but also the ability to actually reassign to different people and reassign en masse. But like I said before, it all centers around the approval step with that allow reassignment. Now, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is I'm going to go on to events. So in terms of business events, there is a new type of business event that's been set up. So previously we could do something where it triggers based on a record change, but now we can trigger by action. Now, where this becomes incredibly useful is, in this case, we've created a new business account, and the trigger condition is if it's added an owner to say who's in charge of this, we can then trigger by action. Now, what that means is, it means that we can set up an action, and in this case, I'm going to create an activity. Or I could create an email, or I could create a lead, create an event. So you can see that once something happens, it's actually actioning and creating another document within the system. So incredibly useful for those workflows. So from that, when I go in and assign this to a subscription, I've now got a thing which says action execution. And if I create an action execution, it then allows me to go in and say, right, when this is being created, use the account number, and then I can start to actually fill out the activity that's going to get created using business account information. So whatever's in this document can populate the next document that it's going to create, or I can simply just set up to say I want it to be a phone call, and it creates an activity with that settings. So incredibly powerful, because you can create something and then get it to create something else based on that. Now also, we've added in an extra ability as well in terms of your email notifications. And the beauty of this is for the record changes, if you're actually tracking fields within a record change, so we can see that this has changed status, it's a shipment confirmation, and we can also track, whichever fields we want to track. Now, when we run this, it then means that when we do an email notification, when we're setting up our template, we can actually go in and say, right, if we wanted to include the previous shipment number, then we've now got the previous information held. So we can put in the previous shipment number, and then this is your new shipment number. And also within the body of the email, the same kind of thing. We can go insert previous data field, and we can then load in anything previously in there and put in the new settings. So just kind of gives them that update of this is what it was, this is what it is now. So incredibly useful feature to add in. Now, in terms of the system as well, one last thing just to mention is that I just wanted to mention about the snapshots and tenants. So within the tenant screen, there used to be the ability to delete tenants and delete snapshots. This has all been now repurposed into an area called delete snapshots and tenants. So it means you've got better control over who can actually do this, and the control from the tenant screen is going to be reduced. Now it allows you to then go through and delete snapshots for all of the companies within this tenant. You can also go through and delete orphan snapshots from within the actual site itself. So within the tenant, it can find all the orphan snapshots, and then you can just go through and delete those or automate the deletion of those as well. Now lastly, the deletion of tenants. Now this is something that you need to be fully aware of what you're doing to actually do this. So just be aware of that. This allows you to actually click on a tenant, and then what it'll do is it'll go through the process of deleting snapshots, deleting orphan snapshots, then start deleting the tenant and taking you through the status of what it's actually doing at the time. So again, it's just making it simpler and it's making it more secure because it's all being run from this one screen, and it means that you can have that level of control over who gets access to that. So that's the system side of things. And the next bit I'm going to concentrate on is to do with some of the changes in finance. So the first thing I'm going to mention is to do with what we know as our sub-account structure. What MYOB and Acumatica have tried to do is to streamline the process and make it a little bit simpler for users. Now, what I mean by that is that, say for example, I'm entering in a stationery expense, I've made a payment from my asset account, my petty cash. Now, if I'm actually using the feature of use default sub-account, it then will pull that through, and my default sub-account is all of these zeros. But when I flick across to use an expense or an income account, then as soon as I select that line, it will effectively just blank out the sub-account if it isn't using default sub-account. Now, it also knows that, in particular, because we're using asset and expense, this sub-account might be completely, just default, whereas this needs to be more defined. So I can put in a different kind of thing in there and it's not defaulting automatically. Now, subsequently, when I add a new line, and if it is an expense account again, as soon as I add that in, you can see that it pulls through the line above because it's an expense account. And so it knows to mimic, it knows to kind of do that to kind of speed things up. So you can see from there, I can just save it and it now just mimics what we had from the expense account. Now, like I mentioned as well, in terms of the chart of accounts, we can also change the GL type of a GL code, but they put some checks in place because in terms of reporting and also in terms of system management, you shouldn't be able to do certain things. So if I try and actually change an income account into an asset account and try and save that, it simply won't allow us to do that because it says you can only change this from an income account to an expense account, because you may have actually set up a GL code, put it into the wrong area, and it should have been, an expense account instead of an income account. So the system now knows that if it is an income account, it can be an expense, or if it's an asset account, it could be a liability account, but it can't flick across the actual reporting methods. Now, one thing I was going to mention in terms of financial periods is that in previous versions, if you actually had an inactive company for some reason or not, and then you reactivated it, it would just reactivate it in the current period. It wouldn't create all of your previous periods. So now, instead of being able to actually tick a little box to say it's now active, you've now got an activate button, and the activate button will go through that check. So what it'll do is when we click on activate, it'll go through and check out what periods are already set up for other companies and actually create those for this company. Now, it only does this for if you are sharing the financial calendars amongst all companies. If you aren't and you're doing multi-financial calendars, then it'll still create it, but it'll create it based on financial calendar for this company. Now, again, like I said, this is just to kind of like neaten things up, and in the same kind of ilk, in terms of the fixed asset module, if you are creating a new company and you've got fixed assets and it needs to load them back in, and it needs to resynchronize because you've been playing around with the financial periods, for example, you can resynchronize the FA calendar with the general ledger calendar. So that just goes through the process and it actually calculates and it goes through and works out what periods are needed to be created, and also goes back through the depreciation to work out if it needs to recalculate depreciation as well. So just to neaten up the process and also to make sure that it's more robust in terms of reactivation and creation of companies. Now, the next bit I want to jump into is to do with payment methods, and this is all centering around the Payables side of things. So one thing that they've added in to speed up the process in terms of that batch payment process is we've now got a quick batch generation tick box, And if that's turned on, it runs in accordance with this batch last reference number. And what that means is that if I go into my prepare payment screen, as soon as you pick your payment method, then you can see this little tick box appears, or I can select to not do this. But if I select a payment method without this selected, this item will just not be there. It kind of gets turned on the payment method or the cash account. Now what that means is that if I've got a bill selected, it's just going to skip the release payment step for us and just streamline it and just make it more efficient. So if I just go process, it just goes through, and you can see it's created the batch payment for me, and it means that I can go to the next steps of uploading it to the bank or releasing it based on how I want to do that. So again, just more of a streamlined and more efficient process in terms of the AP side of things. So the next area I'm going to talk about is CRM. And in terms of CRM, I want to talk about the duplicate validation settings. So what's been added into that is when you're trying to spot duplications, you now have the ability to load these fields in for city, country, state, postal code, and it just means that when you're trying to do your comparison scores to check if they are duplicated, then you can now use these address type fields for that. In terms of some of the features that have been added from a CRM perspective though, I just wanted to mention on the opportunities. So firstly, whenever you are creating an opportunity, if you wanted to actually convert it into being a sales order and that business account that you've been dealing with is a prospect, as soon as I hit create sales order, you now have the ability to create a customer. Now, as you would imagine, this only relates to people who can already do that process. If you try to create a sales order and the customer isn't created and you don't have permission, it will tell you you don't have permission. If you do have permission, you can go through and you can set up to say which customer class we're going to use. You can also get it to say this is the email address for that customer if you want to in particular. And then based on the order type, you go create and review, and it then creates a customer and creates the sales order for you as well. So just again, more efficient and streamlining that process. The other thing to mention within CRM and throughout the entire system is the creation of tasks. So if we look at a task here, they've changed how tasks can be created. So firstly, you can create a task as you normally would through the screen. If you're looking within the activities, you can create a task through there, or you can simply from a task now create another task. So you couldn't add a new record from before, you couldn't complete and follow up before, so those are being added in, so you can kind of do your workflow through your tasks. Secondly, you'll notice that you have the ability to kind of put in a reminder, so you can say when do we want it to be due by, when do we want to be reminded by, and that will pop up as well. Thirdly, you can set up categories, and categories are already previously in there, but now you can put color coding against them, and I'll show the task menu in a moment, but it just allows for better visibility. Now the other thing as well is this related entity type. Now this means that you can then subsequently link it to whatever document, and based on the type it will then populate to show you what do you want to connect it against. So they've just improved the related entity type and related entity feature to make it a little bit easier to use. Now the other thing to mention as well is that under activities, if you wanted to, you could actually create other related activities to do with this task, or even create other tasks within there, and you can kind of flow that through and everything will be held against that task. So again, it's just that usability and making it simpler for people to go through and use tasks on that basis. And if I just jump into my tasks screen, you can see in here that those categories are now easily visible, and anything that's overdue is highlighted in red text to say that this needs chasing up from that point of view. So again, they've just made those improvements to kind of flow through, and based on the business events, if you create tasks based on things that have happened, you can work through your tasks from that side of things. Now the next area we're going to talk about is distribution, and the first part that I'm going to mention is to do with blanket purchase orders. So in terms of blanket purchase orders, there's just a few little things that have been added. The first thing is that previously you could see what you had on a blanket order, so what was your order quantity, but you couldn't necessarily see how many you had on other orders. So now you've got the ability to see on subsequent purchase orders that have been pulled through. We've got 2,000, so that means the blanket open quantity is now set as 3,000. But you can also now see any quantity on receipts from those subsequent purchase orders that you've drawn down from. So it just gives you a bit better visibility to see what's been ordered, what's been receipted, and what is remaining. Now, there's been a bit of major work done within the sales order side of things, and the first bit I'm just going to mention about is to do with the functionality of negative lines. So negative lines are used mainly to do with the RMA process, but also it can be used within the invoice type order types. Now what I mean by that is that when you're going through this process, it makes it a little bit easier. I'm going to bring in something. So I'm going to bring in this seed drill because they're doing a trade-in. Now when I pick it, rather than having to change the operation to put it to a receipt, I can now put in a -1 and it automatically defaults to receipt. So it just means that you don't have to remember, type in a 1, change the operation, oh is it going to be a receipt? You just put in a -1 and it does that for you. And then I can just put in that the trade-in is 50,000 and now my document is correct in terms of what I need to process. So that's kind of one of the main things in terms of the RMA process. They've just made it simpler and made the system actually work it out for you, and you just type in the -1. Now, the other order type that they brought in is they've actually brought in under the order number, they brought in this method of MO, which is a mixed order. So in terms of a mixed order, I can go into here and I can pick out again an item. So in this case, I can actually go through and select an invoice that they brought back. And if I pick that and go add and close, you can see that it automatically comes in because I'm receiving it back in as a receipt and a -1. So it knows based on the method that I'm doing, it's going to receipt it in. And then it also knows, if I look at my payments, that I'm going to create a refund for 4,950. So it knows based on this kind of counter sale methodology, I'm going to create a refund for the customer. Now they may actually want a new one, so I'm going to give them a new one, but I'm actually going to say that this one is slightly damaged, so I'm going to reduce the amount that I'm going to give them back for it because I need to repair it. And now you can see that they owe me an actual amount. So because of that positive amount, it knows that we need to create a payment. So this mixed order method will determine, based on what you're actually doing, whether it's a negative line or whether it's a positive line or the total of the document, what payment or what refund needs to be done. So very smart in terms of just speeding things up and not having to think about changing the method from that point of view. Now the other thing to mention in terms of sales orders and shipments is we now have an archival policy. So we can set up to say after 24 months or 36 months start doing an archiving process, and we can even set up to say when we're running this archiving process, if it runs over 3 hours then just stop and do the next day. Now this means that when we run this archive document screen, it shows us all the documents in question and we can process all, or we can again automate this to just run behind the scenes at 2 a.m. in the morning. Now the beauty of this is that it'll archive them, but just to show you as well, you can actually do this manually, but it's based on the status of the order. So we can see this one's 2018, but this one's open, so it's still got things to do. If it's been completed, it will allow you to archive it manually. If it's still open, you have to process the order or cancel it, then archive it. Now, simply, you can just drill into there and you can go in and say, I want to archive the record. And it actually hides it from generic inquiries, it hides it from the screens, it hides it from the processing when it's running through. So it kind of speeds up the process of the entire system. If you ever need to bring it back, there is a tick box to say show archived items, and you can even come back in and in effect actually go in and restore it, or you can just copy it and create a new order based on that. It doesn't completely delete it, it just hides it from those screens and from that process. Now, the last thing I'm just going to show you in terms of the kind of distribution side of things is under service management. Like I mentioned before, for field services, there's been some major improvements in terms of a fix for the things like calendar boards. So calendar boards previously, if you're using multi-tenants, if you clicked on one of these, it would keep on spinning and loading. And what they've done is they've actually removed some subsequent tables and moved some of the fields across to the main parent tables, and they've speeded up the entire process, made the system run a lot quicker from that point of view. So I just wanted to mention that for the people who are using field services. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about is projects. So if I just jump back into my system. A couple of editions ago, we introduced inventory tracking for projects, but they've actually altered how this is handled a little bit now, made it a bit smarter. So if you are setting up to say track by project quantity and cost, then what this allows you to do is whenever you are using documents such as receipts, issues, adjustments, or transfers, you have a cost layer type, which is going to be either project or normal. Now, if it's set as project, as soon as you select what project it relates to, so in this case, we've got these projects here, and this is based on that setting I showed before, I can then select the warehouse and location, similar to what we have within a normal warehouse. But when I release it, you can see down the bottom, it now shows 9 of 14. Now that means that we've got 9 in stock for this project, but we've got 14 in total within that warehouse location. So it allows you to kind of see for this project how much stock we've got. Now, subsequently, if I issue it by the cost layer of project, I can only issue stock that I have for this project and consume it against that project and then subsequently bill it or whatever I need to. So again, it's really focusing on this is stock only for that project, I'm receipting it, and then I'm shipping it out from project stock. So quite a useful feature. The other thing I'm going to mention as well is to do with allocation rules. So in terms of allocation rules, there is just a feature set up that says when we reverse it, it reverses it based on the original transaction. So previously, as soon as you ran an invoice and it reversed the WIP, it would actually use today's date or the date when you actually ran it, whereas now it actually reverses it out at the original transaction from that point of view. So it just gives you a bit more flexibility. And then lastly, in terms of projects, I just wanted to mention a couple of things, a couple of reports. So there's a few reports that have been created. The first one is open documents for the AR side of things. So AR open documents by customer and by project. And also under receivables, we also have AR aging by project and AR age period sensitive by project. So this is something that people have been asking for. So those have been kind of added into the system. So feel free to have a look at those. But also the project WIP and project WIP detail are reports that were previously in the construction edition, but they've been deemed now to be used for just anyone who is using projects in general. So you can see in here there's a lot of information that previously was just used for construction. So we've got estimated costs, commitments, actuals, cost of completions, forecasting. So these kind of reports are now available in the normal kind of project module. But like I said, there's quite a few reports that have been added, but there are also a lot of reports that have been changed as well. So feel free to look in the release notes for those changes and new additions. And the last thing I'm going to cover off today is to do with manufacturing. So I'm just going to jump into my manufacturing system here. And firstly, I wanted to talk about some of the usability improvements. So firstly, if I just go into my production order maintenance. So if I jump into a production order, so the first thing is under more items, we've actually put them into more of a logical set of headings. So previously these were all just in different areas and different places. So what you can see from here is, firstly, we've got an hold feature. So instead of the tick box previously that put it on hold and took it back off hold, it's now part of the process where you go into there and put it on hold. And based on the status of the report, it then shows you the relevant features that you can actually use. But if we actually look at a one that is currently in process, so if we look at one that's being released, for example, and I go into this one, so within here you can see that under transactions we can release materials. We can also create labor transactions. So previously you had to go into another screen to get to this, so you can do that from production order maintenance. And you can also create purchase orders, create production orders from the replenishment area within that area as well. Now, the other thing to mention is there's a lot of new side panels that have been added to screens like production order maintenance and production order details. So these side panels are just in effect to streamline things and make it easier to look up things. So you can see on here, if I wanted to look at the production order details for this, I could go into here and see relevant information. If I wanted to see critical materials for this production order, I could again go into here and just show items relating to that. I can also go in and look at the MRP results. So this is quite useful for seeing, am I already making this product? So we can see, or am I, going to raise production orders because we need this product? So it just allows you to kind of accumulate all of that information and make sure you're not making too many things. And then from a production order analysis point of view, it gives you the ability to actually look at, where we're currently at, how many hours, what's the cost variance, so on and so forth. Now, if I jump into production details, similar kind of thing, you can see we've got our side panels over here. We've got a really useful one which is called vendor shipments by production order, and that just shows you if any outside processes are being done, then it would actually show you any purchase orders that have been sent out and shipped to that supplier, and you can see that information as well. Then you can also see under where used in production orders, if you've got sub-assembly, it would then show you what main assembly this production order is being used in. So again, very useful for just being able to see things easily. Now, the last thing to mention in here is that we have the settings here, which is set material status to open and set material status to completed. So again, based on the status of your order, it allows you to, if you've completed the actual order and you've forgotten to, supply the material to that order, and you can't do that, then it just allows you to set all of those lines, you can see down here where it says released, to completed. Now, the reason that is useful is then the MRP doesn't go through and order too much stock because it thinks you need that. And so it just means it kind of cuts that extra stock from being purchased. But you can also set them to be open. And if you set it to be open, you can then create a new material supply. Now, it won't directly affect the cost of the actual item that you've finished and completed, but it does then allow you to kind of consume it from stock and consume it to, whichever account you need from a cost of goods sold variance point of view. So quite useful for, just tidying up that MRP side of things, making sure your stock is correct. Now, like I said as well, there are other areas. So bill of materials has some new side panels as well. And as you can imagine, if I go into the bill of materials, you can see in here we've got show engineering change requests, or bill of material attributes, or show engineering change orders. So again, just giving you that easily accessible information from wherever you are. And from the point of view of the MRP, if I go into MRP in here and look at something like MRP display, you can see within here, okay, so this is what it thinks we're going to order, but what is that made up of? So again, it's giving you that information, giving you where that calculation has come from. And in a similar kind of ilk, if you look at the MRP exceptions, if I'm looking at this and going, well, why do I need to delete that? You can then see it's because we've got quite a lot on order. So again, it gives you just an effective way of seeing things rather than drilling in and looking at that information and then coming back. And then the last kind of area I wanted to mention is just to do with this MRP regeneration. Now, what happens when you run through MRP and go through the regenerate side of things? It obviously runs, goes through, calculates everything you need. But then if you want to go back through the history and work out why is it actually running slow, is there certain items that are set wrong or so on and so forth, we've actually included a history area that'll then go through and say, well, this is when it ran, this is how long it took, this is how long the actual counts took. And so you can see how many passes, how many items it's checking, and gives you some really useful information on those processes and when you're going through that MRP process. You can also drill directly into the day and it'll give you and show you a process and give you a breakdown of that as well. So that really concludes today's session on the 2023.1 upgrade. Feel free to look in the release notes because there are lots of other things that have been added. One in particular to note is an experimental feature to do with Teams integration. And if you are interested in that, then please speak to your relevant consultant because it's on a case-by-case basis. But feel free on any of those points or any of the things that I've covered to look through the release notes or get in contact with us. So thanks very much for listening and have a great day.